Reunion is Andrea's 6th novel, and it's been, as probably many of you have seen, it's just been recently released, and it's been really, really incredibly well reviewed, and deservedly, I might say, but as I was saying to her behind, deserved isn't always quite what happens in this
I made
game.
the comment that we don't live in a meritocracy, but there we go.
And I think most of most of the critics have said that it's your best yet. You should be a household name, and so on. It's very much a novel of ideas and of character. It's also, I think I should say by way of introduction, the first of Andrea's novels since her partner Dorothy Porter died, as I'm sure you will all know, at the end of last year. The novel was finished before Dorothy died. I think Dorothy will be here with us in spirit, and her poetry is mentioned in the book, along with many, many other poets, and I'm sure she will float in and float out. So I'd like to just kind of think that we have her here with us in spirit. We're going to start this morning by Andrea's going to read a couple of pages, and then she's going to tell you, kind of set up what the novel's about, who is the reunion between, and when and why are they reunioning.
Thanks, Drusilla. All authors, or certainly me, I'm always worried about who's going to come. I knew there'd be various Porters, and there are, and there'd be various Goldsmiths, and I thought, who else is going to come? And I have to say, it's lovely to see you all here, both the faces that are familiar, thank you, and the faces that are not familiar, really thank you, and it means a lot. But you always do worry. But actually, one of the benefits of festivals like this is that you actually meet readers, which is, after all, why we write, or one of the reasons why we write. I'm just going to read the first couple of pages to set up Reunion. On a chill Melbourne evening early in the new millennium, Jack Adelson was driving across town. The city roads were clogged with 6 o'clock traffic. Rap music blared through the open window of a hotted-up Holden. Jack idled closer to the van in front. The music thumped, the traffic dribbled forward, exhaust smoke hovered in the glare of headlights. Jack was about to realise a dream as familiar as his own skin, a reunion with the friends of his youth. It had been 20 years since they were last together, and he should have been excited. He should have been prepared to dump the car and complete the last kilometres on foot. Instead, he wanted to whip the car round, ram the accelerator, and bolt into the night. It was Ava he dreaded seeing, Ava Bryant, the woman he had loved throughout their undergraduate years in Melbourne, their postgraduate study in Oxford, and all through her long marriage to Harry. It was the sort of love, as futile loves always are, that flourishes best in the absence of the beloved, sustained by dreams and memories and the reliable satisfactions of pure invention. Jack was about to see Ava again, in the flesh and with a husband alongside, and he felt like a man driving to his own execution. Jack and Ava are two of the characters who met at university in the late 1970s. The others were Helen and Conrad, who was their philosophy lecturer. Back in the 1970s, university was a very different place than it was now, than it is now. It was free, for a start, and there was also a freedom that had been brought about by women's liberation and also the pill being available. And these four people, they came of age in wonderful times. In fact, their days were sparked with wonder. They said that. They travelled on to Oxford together, and then they went their separate ways. And each of them made a name for themselves in very different spheres. Ava is a novelist. She's written 6 novels, and she is writing her 7th, and she has a world reputation. She married the fairly horrible Harry when she was very young, and they've lived in Oxford. Then there's Helen, who's a molecular biologist, whose most enduring relationship has been to bacteria. She is passionate about science. And at the time that the novel opens, she is in an ethical dilemma in that the research that she's doing that will, she hopes, develop a vaccine that will help combat diarrhoea, particularly in refugee camps, the same research can be used for bioweaponry. Then there's Connie. He's 10 years older than the others. He was their philosophy teacher at Melbourne University. He's heading for 60. He is a celebrity philosopher like Alain de Botton, but he has doubts about where he's going. He also, as he's gotten older, his girlfriends have stayed the same age, 25, and he's had 3 wives, and he's about to dump number 3. So, and then we've got Jack. Jack, they all consider was the brightest of them all. He was and is a scholar of Islam, but his own scholarship has waned and in fact dried up as Ava has come to occupy more of his headspace. And in fact, he's lived on the opposite side of the world to Ava. He's the only one that came back to Australia, and he has maintained for Ava, the friendship, but for him, this obsessive love through weekly letters, gorgeous letters. In fact, the love is very much imagined as obsessive loves are. These 4 are brought back to Melbourne by Harry, Ava's husband, for whom they all have the most terrible disdain. He set up an organisation called NOGA, which was a lot of fun to set up, Network of Global Australians. Ostensibly, it's been set up to tap into the wealth of knowledge of Australians living overseas, but, you know, it's an online organisation, so goodness knows what Harry's up to. That's the group that are going to meet up at the reunion, and we know there's going to be trouble.
There's going to be trouble of various and many sorts. One of the things I really like about this novel is the way that it is a novel of ideas, and the way in which the ideas and the characters coalesce around each other. And maybe it would be a good idea to kind of go through some of those interconnections. Jack's obsession, when we first meet it, is quite disabling in a way, that he hasn't done all that he might have done with his life. You say somewhere that he thinks of himself in the third person, and we might come back again to Jack because then that starts to turn. But I don't know if you'd like to start talking about the kind of, if you like, the sort of negative side of obsession.
I mean, I've always been interested in obsession. I think that a lot of creative artists probably are, because I think that without the obsession, you don't get the work done. I mean, you need to be, if we just hold on Jack for the moment, you need to be very, very focused. You need to ignore the dishes in the sink. You need to be happy to stay in your pyjamas until 3 o'clock. Things get left while you are obsessed. You are driven to get the work done. And in fact, I think it's Conrad in this book. No, it's not. It's Jack in this book. He wonders what will happen to original work, given that children these days, if they show obsessive tendencies, it's pathologised and they're taken off to some sort of specialist and had it rubbed out. That's if they have the time to actually develop an obsession in the first place. I mean, after they've been to karate and creative dancing and cricket and football and all of those after-school activities, they don't have time to actually develop the obsession. But if they did, they'd be taken off to a psychiatrist. So you do wonder what is going to happen to original work. And one of the reasons why I created all of these characters who all have these driving, except for Jack, work passions, was to show, I think, what is a positive side to obsession. We get original work. We also get a bunch of fairly selfish people, but really interesting selfish people. Jack he demonstrates the more common idea of obsession, which is obsessive love, which is such a contradiction in terms, because obsessive love has got nothing to do with the beloved and everything to do with you. And even more so with Jack, who's maintained this love 13,000 miles away from Ava. It's all in his imaginings. He is, of all of them, the one less likely to take risks. He is a more, he's not cowardly, he's just less bolshy than the others. He describes all of his friends as centre stage people, and he's never seen himself like that. So we have a shy-ish person who has created a very satisfying life between his ears. It's also safe. It's got all of the answers. Again, no risks. And I'm very partial to Jack, because during the course of this novel, they all change, but in a way he changes most of all, because he actually realises how his total focus on Ava has dried up the rest of his life, and he's become somebody that he wouldn't actually admire and he never wanted to be. So he was a really interesting character to write.
And by the end of the novel, he was the one I also came most to be interested in, and thought that the changes that had happened in him were the most crystallising and interesting. But I think maybe before we come back to what happens to Jack, because it's so intertwined with what happens to all of them, let's have a look at Helen and Ava. They're the two women. They're the two who both exemplify in many ways the best of creative obsessions in the way you were speaking of. If you didn't have that focus, you don't get the work done. And each of them has what seems I've called a sort of an originating question around them. So Helen, who's the molecular biologist, you've already told us a little bit about her bacteria that can be used, that her work to stop terrible diarrheas in the third world can also have a nasty applications. So the originating question, the kind of ethical question hangs around her is, could she do anything morally questionable? And I'd really like it if you could kind of tease some of that out. And who are her scientific mentors? Because one thing's so interesting in this book is the way you pull in history and other scientists and other examples of this kind of dialogue.
This is one of the joys of the novelist. I mean, novels are long in the writing. You're stuck there in your pyjamas at your desk for 4 years. You've got to make sure that it holds your interest, particularly if you have a very poor threshold to boredom, which I certainly do. I've long been interested I tell you when I did get interested in the physicists of the first half of the 20th century, less in their physics and more in their work as creators. I mean, they were amazingly creative people, particularly the theoretical physicists. I started reading about them the year that Dot got cancer. And I had actually started Reunion by then, and there was no way I could work on fiction. I needed to plunge deep into other people's lives, involved in a creative endeavour that was very, very different to mine. I became quite fixated on a number of these physicists. I wrote a long essay back then, but when it came to creating Helen, who's a molecular biologist, I decided that I would give her my interest in the physicists, which I'm allowed to do because I can indulge myself. In earlier drafts, let me tell you, I indulged myself miles too much, and I had to slice off many, many, many thousands of words about theoretical physics. To your benefit, I have to say, definitely to your benefit. Helen had, as an 18-year-old, she had always defended science. Back in the late 70s, and early 80s, science had a fairly bad press. I mean, there were gas disasters, there was Chernobyl that came later, there was thalidomide was still, around. Science was getting a very bad press, and she would defend it. And she would say that science in and of itself is a good thing. She believed absolutely in the idea of progress, that when science turns bad, it's because bad people are running the show. And here she finds herself, 25 years on, involved in research that she knows is being used by the people who run her laboratory, and it's no more her laboratory than a lot of the physicists who are working under Hitler, or indeed in the Manhattan Project. It wasn't their laboratory either. Other people were pulling the strings. And this is the case with Helen. So she's caught with this dilemma of what she would be willing to put up with ethically in order to do her science. And at one stage she says she never thought that she'd be the sort of scientist who would ever have to ask that sort of question of herself. She doesn't want to ask the question. She wants all questions of ethics to go away. And we actually follow her with her struggles a bit, because much more interesting to Helen than her struggles happens to be the absolute joy she gets out of science. So I actually, at one stage, there's a chapter where we go with Helen to a scientific meeting of the best in the world, and she is just in scientist Disneyland. It's fantastic. And it was a lovely thing for somebody who's a non-science person to actually create that sort of world. And as she's deliberating with her own dilemma, she does call on two main dead scientists now, in particular. Fritz Haber, who some of you might know. He was a German working before and during the First World War in Berlin. He was the guy who worked out the method of fixing nitrogen from the air for the commercial production of fertiliser, and exactly the same research was used in making explosives. So single-handedly, Haber ensured food for the populace during the war and more efficient killing. And to add to the more efficient killing, he also was the man behind chlorine gas in the First World War. He was a great German patriot, and he was also a Jew. It went all right during the First World War, but once Hitler came to power, absolutely didn't. And first he lost his job, he lost his science, and then he lost his country. But to the end, he died a year later in 1934 in Switzerland. To the end, he remained a great German patriot. And I have Helen reflecting on patriotism, and after all, she's lived in America for 20 years. She knows patriotism done gorgeously, as only the Americans can do it. And she's wary of that too. She's such a knowing person, but she wants to do her science.
Ava and Helen have a lot in common, although they stand, in a sense, on the two poles of fiction and science. In some ways, they represent the duality, and in some ways, there's a lot that they share. And one of them is that I think you speak somewhere of the calling of both science and literature. So in a way, they share the creative obsessions, they share that sense of calling. And Ava, indeed, one of her novels was a sort of around the question of the sort of Faustian pact, which was made in order to produce music, not science, but in order to produce music. So it's kind of the same question. So in a way, there's something quite sort of similar about them. And I wondered if you would like to speak of that, but also of how you see fiction and science as kind of that movement of similar and different. And is it, I suppose, that they represent different truths, or do they represent different paths to truth? Do they call upon different ethical questions or different versions of the same ethical questions?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I hadn't realised the extraordinary similarities between fiction writing and theoretical science. But in both cases, you do a lot of work between your ears, a lot of time sort of sitting back, relaxing. Or so it seems, sitting back. I mean, you know the old story about someone comes in and sees a writer stretching out on the couch, and there's a glass of something warm nearby, and a book is lying open in their lap, and the person who comes into the room says, "Oh, what are you doing?" And the writer says, "I'm working." And I think a number of scientists do that as well. I certainly think you need to be driven. I mean, the fact is that with both theoretical science and with fiction, you start off with nothing and you have the chutzpah to think in the end you're actually going to come up with something that somebody wants. I mean, whether it be a book for the readers or, in fact, some useful science. And there's something quite absurd about that. I mean, you literally start with nothing. So you do need, I love that old-fashioned notion of calling. I mean, it's such an old-fashioned word. And Helen says that she and Ava recognised it in each other at 18. But I think that there's also other similarities here. Both Helen and Ava were born in 1960. Both of them they were the first of their families to finish school, much less go to university. Both of them had an older man who took them under their wing and, in fact, guided them towards the future. With Helen, the older man was a teacher at her high school. She would have been about 14 at the time, and this teacher coached her after school and on the weekends for a scholarship to a college in Melbourne, which she duly won. Of course, this sort of thing couldn't happen these days, but without this man, and everything was quite above board, without this man, Helen, I don't know that she would have worked out the way to, become the scientist that she did. Helen also had Ava's beginnings were similar in some ways to Helen, but whereas Helen had a lot of love, Ava absolutely didn't. And Ava always knew, this was the notion of calling, that she wanted to write novels. And she also knew that she needed to get to university. She knew she would get no help from her mother. And the way she does get help, actually, and I'm not letting anything out of the bag because you find this out fairly early on, she's 15 and the man's in his 40s and it ain't innocent. Is it mutually beneficial? Absolutely. Fight me on that one.
Let's switch a little bit to thinking about you in this novel. There's a very nice piece that you write somewhere of saying that self-portraiture is simultaneously an act of self-conjuring and of disguise. Well, I think the same might possibly be said of fiction.
Yep.
You also said in an interview that the characters and their situations were entirely imaginary, but the ideas were yours. And one of the things I loved about it and noted very much, and particularly here Dorothy floats back into the room, what an enormous amount of quotations there are and references to writers as well as Helen scientists throughout the book. And this is where I see perhaps a kind of a map of your mind emerging. The writers, the novelists, and the poets, including, I might say, Dorothy Porter, along with Gwen Howard and Bruce Beaver as the three, I think the only three actual Australian poets who arrived. So how much can we read this as, a kind of, as you?
It's fiction. I like making things up. I like making up characters. I like getting under the skin of people who are not only not me, I mean, I'm known to me, I am dull to me. The characters I write are people that I might not meet in a lifetime, but might want to know more about. So the characters are made up, and I really, really enjoy doing that. But as I said before, the ideas, I mean, novels are long in the writing, and I have to make sure that the characters and the narrative are wrapped around ideas and issues that are going to hold my interest. So, if I look at the ideas in this particular novel, I mean, it's a novel, it's a story. You can read it as a story about people who I hope have got, flesh on their bones, that you can actually feel them as if real, even though they're made up. I mean, that's what fiction does. But the ideas that their lives and dilemmas actually portray are things to do with obsession, which I've mentioned, fundamentalism, in a way, yes, religious fundamentalism, but also I was really interested in the sort of fundamentalist thought that characterised our times during the Howard years and the Bush years in America, thought that had all of the answers. This is fundamentalist, totally. So I was interested in that. And I was also very much interested in memory and identity and how memory feeds identity. And what would actually happen if memory became frail, what would happen to the sense of self. And I'm not letting anything out of the bag when I say that, because it says on the back of the book that one of the characters does not survive. And one of the things that I was interested in looking at is if you know that you are heading to a fairly terrible end, what would you do? And
this, of course, is what skews the whole, not skews the whole novel, skews the relationship between all of them.
It does.